Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. A hectic show for you tonight. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. Bombshell criticisms today from a former Chief of Army about Australia's lack of military capability, specifically our drone capability. Now, drones are changing the game in the Middle East and Ukraine, but nowhere to be seen here at home. Labor talked a big game on defence with its strategic review last year. To date, it's still nothing but talk. More cultural heritage madness with a popular walking trail now locked off to the public. The locals are refusing to cop it, turning up on Australia Day for an early morning hike in defiance. It's all in the name of Indigenous culture. So why do so many Indigenous locals not support this madness? More on that shortly. Plus, speaking of madness, one inner-city Melbourne council might actually give in to the vandals and permanently remove a monument to Captain Cook. Now, at what point do we become a country that acquiesces to the mob? While Labor MPs are out spruiking their tax cuts, leaked polling out of Dunkley ahead of the election shows the PM is seriously on the nose. And good news today with the Coalition committing to scrap funding of the Activist Environmental Defenders Office. Now, that's the same organisation slammed by a federal judge for confecting evidence just weeks ago.
The Environmental Defenders Office has been given millions of dollars of ongoing funding by the Albanese government to wage lawfare. They're a proxy for the government's true intent in relation to addressing projects which have already had valid approvals. The EDOs lost their federal court case with the judge determining that evidence was confected and lacked integrity. This is a body being funded by the Albanese government.
But first, make no mistake, we have a government in Canberra that's determined to change the country and change it beyond recognition. Before the election, the PM was ever so eager to reassure voters, despite his long history inside Labor's left faction, that he was safe change. So he played Mr. Nice Guy up against Scott Morrison, who was really on the nose, and said nothing about his plans for higher taxes, bigger government, and upending our national and cultural symbols. But that's what it's all been about from day one of this government. It's been more and more of the Green Left's long march through the institutions, mostly by stealth, in the hope that you won't notice really what's happening. But when you're awake to it, when we do say no, like we resoundingly did last year on The Voice, the Green Left just carry on as if what we think as mere voters doesn't matter. The latest move towards an ever more powerful Big Brother government is Greg Combey's appointment as head of the Future Fund, the $200 billion sovereign wealth fund that's supposed to maximise returns on taxpayer investments to help pay public service and defence superannuation. As with superannuation more generally, Labor does not regard wealth as belonging to the people who earn it. It thinks your assets are there to be mobilised by government for the purposes of the state. To Labor, people and property are ultimately at the service of the state rather than the other way around. Now, Greg Combey, the former ACTU boss and climate change minister in the Rudd-Gillard government, is currently chairman of something called the Net Zero Economy Agency, and has also been the chair of the industry super fund peak body called Industry Super Australia. Now, incredibly, this Green Left functionary was asked by the Morrison government to help advise on pandemic policy. But that's another story of the Coalition being inclined to surrender to its ideological enemies. But what this latest appointment shows is just how dead set determined the Albanese government is on conscripting your money for its purposes. The same government, remember, that said your tax cut was safe, that your super was safe, that your power bill would decline, but then it did the exact opposite. And that now says utterly implausibly that your investment nest egg, your super, is safe with them. Come on. As head of this net zero agency, Combey says that Australia needs to unlock, quote, $3 trillion in retirement savings to fund green energy boondoggles and social housing projects, the very projects that the private sector will not support without hefty taxpayer subsidies because they just don't make economic sense. Well, now here's Dracula in charge of the blood bank. because as chairman of the Future Fund, there's no doubt that CommBay will follow through with his push to use the fund's $200 billion balance sheet to invest in all the green stuff that as Climate Minister under Rudd he was obsessed with, not what will give the fund its best returns. Now, it's no wonder that the outgoing chairman, the man who set up the Future Fund, Peter Costello, who did it, of course, at a time when governments routinely ran surpluses, remember those, well, he has warned the government to keep its, quote, sticky fingers out of the way. And former Commonwealth Bank boss David Murray, well, he's called CommBay a political appointment who could, he says, undermine the Future Fund's independence. Greg CommBay has, to quote Murray, been a cheerleader for this nation-building stuff, he said. But what else could you expect from this government, from a Treasurer whose stated policy objective is not to make the economy more productive by cutting tax and red tape, but to force big business to contribute corporate dollars to Labor's political agenda? Now, Chalmers is fooling no one when he said, as he appointed CommBay, that the Future Fund needs, and I quote, fresh thinking, he says, fresh leadership, notwithstanding the fact that Costello's leadership has delivered 9% annual returns over the past decade. Now, as Australians, we're going to wake up here to Labor's agenda because they're not even 2 years into office and the pace of their change is scarifying. They've appointed a big government lefty type to run the Productivity Commission, and they've reworked the Reserve Bank's charter to include more social objectives. It's why Labor are changing the superannuation rules to limit people's ability to use their super to help with the purchase of their first home, as originally proposed by the coalition at the last election. But it doesn't stop there. Ask yourself, why has big business suddenly become so vocal in support of left-wing political causes such as The Voice, gay marriage, gender identity, trans debate, as well as changing Australia Day? Now, have you ever asked yourself, how are the unions so well funded despite their membership falling from some 50% of workers to scarcely 10% of the private sector workforce? Well, look no further than these industry super funds. They now control almost $1.5 trillion of your money and have about 7 million members. And over the past 2 years, they reportedly gave $25 million to the unions, whose leaders dominate these super boards. Then, of course, much of that money was then recycled to the Labor Party. Now, why this is so dangerous to market economies like ours is that it's these same industry super funds who now own a large slab of our public companies. And they use this ownership stake to push their woke mates onto boards and to push their green left political agenda. Now, when Bill Kelty and Paul Keating set up the compulsory super scheme more than 3 decades ago now, well, they knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to capture capitalism, to change its focus from freedom to control and from economic reform to social change. They could see then that workers didn't want to join unions anymore, and they knew that unions were essential to Labor's power base and its funding. So they forced workers into union-dominated industry super funds, which would then keep the unions solvent and drive Labor's political and social agenda, which it's done in spades. All the while, of course, Liberals were asleep at the wheel, watching it happen, but lacking the guts because of left-wing moderates in the Liberal Party room to do much to stop it. Now, let's hope that the next coalition government has the wit to see what's been done and the courage and guts to reverse it. Now, look, today, the latest instalment in the continual efforts to demonise our heroes, tear down our history by ignorant vandals. The Yarra Council, which is responsible for the Edinburgh Gardens, where a statue of Captain James Cook has stood for over 100 years, says it's now looking at taking the statue down and locking it away permanently in storage because the clowns on the council say, Repairing the vandalism is costly. Now, quite rightly, local residents, well, they're up in arms. They say it just rewards the vandals. Here is the head of Yarra Residents Collective, Adam Prominence, on Melbourne's 3AW this morning.
If you're just going to let vandals and criminals win, then you might as well just give up altogether. I think most residents would turn around and go, you know what, this isn't the right way to have the discussion, this isn't the right way to do things. You don't just get your own way by going and being destructive and antisocial and causing criminal acts of damage.
Now, look, what upsets me most about this whole saga is that if young Australians actually knew Cook's story, they'd demand more statues be put up rather than torn down. First things first, he was an explorer, a discoverer. He wasn't a settler. He's not to be confused with Arthur Phillip, who landed here with the First Fleet. Cook's ship, the HMS Endeavour, that sailed to the other end of the earth, was not much bigger than a standard tennis court. Now imagine that. Imagine the bravery in an era with little to no means of communications and only rudimentary instruments. Cook joined the Royal Navy as a teenager with little formal education. But he sailed to a standard that would put a modern seafaring captain to shame, using just the stars, a compass and a sextant to guide him. He sailed to places that were largely uncharted. Now imagine that. It's like, in modern day terms, heading into space with what most 10-year-olds might have in their pencil case and no more. He left a legacy of scientific and geographical knowledge that few in the world have ever bettered. And as his biographer, Rob Mundell, a sailor himself, said to me when I interviewed him a few years back, the most extraordinary thing is that the charts Cook mapped of our coastline, remember, without modern technology, well, they remain accurate today within centimetres. Now think of that, you cretins, before you tear down someone who deserves to be honoured, not abused in this way. All right, busy day in Canberra. Let's go there now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has cast doubt on Labor's commitment to not tweak franking credits or negative gearing after it broke its promise on the Stage 3 tax cuts. Having walked away from an election promise, the Prime Minister adamant he can still be trusted.
We now have, without a doubt, a liar in the lodge.
Australians can trust me to be prepared to make difficult decisions.
Political battle lines drawn on the issue of Stage 3 as questions raised over its impact on aspiration.
Stage 3 was all about rewarding aspiration, something that I believe in doing for Australians.
Question marks about whether Labor's policy is properly costed, question marks about whether it's inflationary.
And what other tinkering could be on the table.
This next stage of tax changes around negative gearing and the family home. The Prime Minister doesn't have a mandate for any of it.
As the coalition moves to finalise its position, Labor says the opposition is divided.
They're all over the shop, aren't they? They're so addicted to saying no to everything that Susan Ley, her first response was to say that they were going to fight it and they were against it. They didn't know what it was.
The Liberals and Nationals are still led by a divisive leader, and they are still a divided coalition.
The coalition is buying itself some time to gauge the options with punters. Either way, they won't have to wait long to see how the shake-up lands with voters. The first electoral test is the Dunkley by-election on March 2. A senior Fijian military officer, allegedly responsible for human rights abuses, has been appointed Deputy Commander of the Australian Army's 7th Brigade. The Australian government is facing criticism it has turned a blind eye to the position in its bid to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific.
I am absolutely sure that the Fijian government and the Australian government are also looking very closely at this and will undertake investigations to decide whether or not the continuation of his appointment in this role is appropriate.
Meanwhile, it's being urged to intervene in a potential security and policing deal between Papua New Guinea and China.
In December, we signed our security agreement between Australia and PNG. We are the security partner of choice for Papua New Guinea, as we are for most of the countries in the Pacific.
Lot to get through there, isn't there? Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell joins me now. Great to have you, Andrew. Tuesday, as always. Let's start in the Melbourne seat of Dunkley. That by-election, of course, on the 2nd of March. Big test for Labor because they should hold this seat. It's a 6% margin. And of course, the Labor incumbent died in office, which tends to provide somewhat of a sympathetic vote. Certainly has in the past. But this is important. Polling in the seat, and this was prefaced a couple of days ago by Peter Dutton. It is for Labor a shocker, we're told. There's leaked internal Liberal polling out today that says the PM's in serious net negative territory, a massive 11 points down. But also a published poll from Roy Morgan today that says the coalition's primary vote well ahead of Labor on 37.5 and into party preferred terms at 49.5, just a tad there behind Labor. Well, Andrew Clennell, what do you think is driving all of this?
Well, I don't normally, sorry, I've just got myself in my ear here, if the technical people can look after that. Peter, I don't see Roy Morgan as particularly reliable.
Have we got Andrew Clennell?
But I do see a trend against the government here. OK, that's been corrected. And I think that's pretty standard mid-term, but he's suffering from two events. One is cost of living. The other is the failed voice, which has diminished him in the eyes of some voters. So, and in terms of Dunkley, my information is it's line ball and the Liberals can win, certainly before these tax cut changes. Now, I think the fact that the tax cut changes only give those at the lower end another $16.40 a week from July is not enough. It is not enough. So, Peter, I think that I still think the Liberals are in with a solid chance in Dunkley. I believe that Anthony Albanese will struggle there, and I believe that he should have done more in terms of this cost of living package if he wanted to win the by-election. I think it should have been $30 or $40 a week for those on lower to middle incomes. So that's just casting aside the broken promise, the fact there are now many people on higher incomes in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, and FIFO workers in WA who will be doing, who won't vote for Anthony Albanese again. It's as simple as that after this. But that is not as big a percentage as the government keeps pointing out as those who are receiving the benefit. The problem is many of those people have much more expensive mortgages, much more expensive rents, more expensive groceries, more expensive electricity bills, and $16.40 doesn't punch a hole in that, and they only get it in July. So actually, to be honest, I'll wait for the news poll. I don't buy the Morgan polls. Considering where they're at with the cost of living, it could be even worse for the government. And this is where Peter Dutton needs to ensure that he does some work this year, later in the year admittedly, on being the alternative, on saying to people, vote for me. He'll do well from wrecking it or seeking to wreck the government. There's enough to work with, but there's not division there. There's not the leadership push on that there was in the last Labor government at this time. So he needs to start presenting an agenda, in my book.
I think you're spot on, the fact they're not going to see anything from these tax cuts. When they do, it's $16. Not even a lobster, right? Not even $20. $20 a week doesn't touch the sides, given all the increases that people have copped. I mean, this is the reality of it. I mean, people can add up, and the cost of this, you know, the cost to the Prime Minister's character, to Labor's word, I think is huge. I mean, we saw that push on in the papers yesterday from unnamed Labor backbenchers saying that they want to rip apart negative gearing. Of course, you wheel out the Treasurer who says, look, we're not going to touch it. He doesn't rule it out forever, but he says we have no plans. Well, after what happened last week, who the hell's going to believe them?
Oh, absolutely. And this is a real problem when you break a promise this big. It's very hard to accept his word on that stuff. One would hope if they were contemplating anything like that, like John Howard did with the GST, you take it to an election. That's the real issue here with this. But yeah, I mean, they've done it once. Unless there's enough of an outcry against it, they'll do it again. Look, Dunkley's really shaping is so fascinating, and it just shows you how Australian politics can turn so quickly. We're going to be there in the studio in Melbourne, Peter, 11 months after a result where Albanese was on top of the world doing what he shouldn't have done, and that's winning Aston, and the opposite result. looks, at least 50% likely. That's just an 11-month period. And that shows why there's no room for complacency in federal politics.
If you live in the seat, get used to seeing me. I've been popping down there quite a bit. I'll keep going all the way through. I like to get, we call it field research, right? I don't like to just read the polls. I like to get on the ground. I like to talk to people. I like to see how many houses are for rent, how many shops are for lease, all that sort of stuff to make my assessment on the seat. Talk to me about the game being played here by Labor. They're trying to make these tax changes, which were their problem last week, broken promises and all that, into a problem for the Libs. They're trying to seed some idea that there's division. Now, I sent a few messages today to the Liberals and said, do not get spooked by this. Do not fall into Labor's trap. It doesn't matter what you guys think about this until you see the legislation. And in any event, what you might do at the next election, should you win, that's a good year off, you're going to make this about Labor. This still is Labor's problem.
Yeah, I mean, Peter Dutton's indicated he's not announcing anything this week. He wants to make it about the government. That seems fair. He probably wants to get some research done on it in Dunkley as well, quite frankly and cynically, might I say. But what I think would make sense is if they seek to amend it in the Senate to reinstate it for the higher income earners. They keep the tax cut for the lower income earners. They listen to Jim Chalmers whack the table and say you're fiscally irresponsible. You just say, well, what choice did I have when you guys reneged on your promise? And then you just pass the government's package and say, we'll do better for higher income earners at the next election, and Jim Chalmers won't. I mean, that's, you got to have a whole shadow cabinet discussion. They might get spooked by the fiscally irresponsible argument the government will mount, but that's what I'd do, I'll tell you right now.
Just quickly, how do the Teals play this? Because, they're in the most affluent seats. Their people lose the most out of these stage 3 tax cut changes. They all said they wanted tax reform, sure, and they also wanted integrity in government. Well, they've got neither out of last week. How do they sell this to their electorates? Presumably they're going to pass it.
Well, I don't think Allegra and Zali are, and I think they're smart not to do so because they've got the electorates with the most people over 180, as if you could afford to live in Manly or Bondi if you weren't on 180. But, in terms of at least as a homeowner, they have renters as well, right? But the rest of them, it's going to cause real issues. They're the ones who've copped the wedge the most. The government hopes to wedge, the opposition, even the Greens, is wedge this Teal wall which stands between Peter Dutton and Labor. And it's going to be quite difficult for them. The ones I don't understand the most, and we pulled together this graphic today, are Kate Chaney and Curtin. And, I grew up in Perth. I know how wealthy Curtin is. Cottesloe and Nedlands and all these areas, and Monique Ryan in Kooyong. And I think that's opened the door for the Liberals. I think Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers have allowed the Liberals a chance in some of these seats they wouldn't have otherwise had a chance in, Peter.
We will watch this closely. Andrew Clennell, thank you as always. All right, we've already been told that you can't celebrate Australia Day because of so-called colonial shame. And now it seems our shared access to Australia's spectacular natural landscape is also under threat depending on your skin colour. And that's what's happening now. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the hiking trail up Mount Warning in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales was closed. But after COVID, it stayed closed on account, we were then told, of its cultural significance. We're also told there to Indigenous Australians. It costs New South Wales taxpayers right now $7,000 a week to post security guards at all the trail entrances to keep it closed. But it doesn't end there. In 2022, the New South Wales Department of National Parks recommended handing over the management of the Mount Warning site to the Wollumbin Consultative Group, a small collective of local Indigenous families and community organisations. The group has previously claimed that allowing females, including Indigenous females, on the site would ruin its cultural significance. Well, one man who refuses to be locked out of this national park by acquiescing to these activists is Mark Hendricks, who defied the current ban to climb up and watch the sunrise on Mount Warning on Australia Day. And Mark joins me now. Well, it seems wrong to me, Mark, that a national park is no longer open to everyone who lives in this nation. And of course, taxpayers pay to protect it, look after it, but taxpayers are also paying for these security guards to lock you out. Tell me what's so special about this place and why the ban came into effect.
Peter, look, Mount Warding National Park is one of the most beautiful national parks on the east coast of Australia. The mountain itself represents the remains of a 23 million year old shield volcano. You think Hawaii, but on the land. And since it erupted, it's travelled northwards with the Australian continental plate around about 1,500 kilometres, and it now sits in this wonderful subtropical climate near the Queensland border, where it's covered in a lush subtropical rainforest. There are beautiful plants, flowers, reptiles, birds to be found there. The views from the summit are simply extraordinary, and you won't get them anywhere else in northern New South Wales. It's just simply a magical place. In the early 1900s, the people of Murwillumbah recognised its beauty and they petitioned the state government for it to be preserved as a national park. And in 1929, that was declared. And the track that they built was so good that the Attorney General who opened the park was able to ride to within 200 metres of the summit on horseback with his wife. Now, the summit, the park was then opened where there were about 200 people at the summit, including about a lot of local school children attended. So the locals there just acknowledged how important and special the place was, and they established that national park for all Australians. Now, as you mentioned, you know, in 2020, in March, National Parks moved in and put a temporary closure to do with the COVID pandemic. But the move to close the park has come over probably since around about 2006, when a sign from the Bundjalung Nation stated that they preferred people not to climb to the summit. So the moves to close the park by National Parks were in place for a long time, and it seems that COVID provided a real opportunity for them to action those plans under the cover of the state government lockdowns. Yeah.
So I'm told, correct me if I'm wrong, that not all Indigenous people in the region actually agree with the closure. Many support your pleading, your protest, that the park should remain open to all Australians.
Look, up until the claims that the park was especially sacred only emerged in the very late 1990s. You know, I've got a beautiful glossy document here, a guide to climbing Mount Warning, which was published by National Parks in 1993, and that celebrates the climb. It calls the climb a staircase to the sky. And there's no mention in this document in 1993 that there were any problem with people climbing to the summit. So at the millennium, that sort of turnover between 1999 and 2000, National Parks had a billet of 60 people to attend the summit sunrise, you know, to experience the first sunrise of the millennium. And at that stage, right at the close to the event being held, a single Aboriginal man from remote from the area claimed that he had a problem with people climbing to the summit, and he wanted that climb closed, despite it being authorised by National Parks and agreed to by the Tweed Byron Land Council. So that's when this thing all started. And since that time, there's been a lot of disagreement from different Aboriginal groups in northern New South Wales about it. The most important being the UNRWA people, who are the traditional owners based on National Parks' own research, which was published in their management plan in the 1990s. In 2007, one of the key figures of the UNRWA group, a lady called Marlene Boyd, stated, and she called out those fake Bundjalung claims on the mountain, and she stated, it's a beautiful statement. She said, one, she supported the public access to the summit, and she said, how can the public experience the spiritual significance of this land if they do not climb the summit and witness creation? That statement is just such a universal statement of human values, you know. And National Parks just ignored her, ignored her for 20 years, ignored her family. Sadly, she died in 2007, and it seems that they were able to push through with their plans to support these Bundjalung claims since that time. It's just astonishing. Australia Day, I had the real pleasure of climbing to the summit with Marlene's son, Sturt Boyd. So he invited us to the summit to climb with him on Australia Day, and it was just such a magical experience to see that sunrise with Marlene's son, Sturt, and an incredible experience. It just goes to show that there is not a consensus among Aboriginal people about the summit climb. It's simply not true. It's one of the lies that National Parks have promulgated. Yeah.
All strength to your arm. I'm almost out of time, but I want you to tell people where they can go to in terms of your Facebook group and support the stand you're taking on behalf of all Australians.
Sure. Look, there's a couple of groups. There's the Reopen Mount Warning Facebook group, so you can find that obviously on Facebook. And I'm wearing the Save Our Summits T-shirt. That's another association that's formed. So this problem is not just in New South Wales, so it's spread across to other peaks. Save Our Summits was formed in particular to save Mount Beerwah and Mount Tibrogargan from being closed for similar reasons as Mount Warning. So you can find us online, Save Our Summits. They've got a website and we've got a Facebook page. We're not going to let this... This fight is not over by a long shot. Hopefully next Australia Day, Peter, we can climb up there legally and just celebrate Australia together. It's such a great nation, and Mount Warning is a symbol of that great nation. It's just so sad to see what national parks have done to it.
Brilliant work, Mark. Keep it up. We'll stay in touch.
Thank you, sir.
There you go. Head to his Facebook page, those various Facebook pages. Stay across the fight. Get involved, please. His riders coming right across Australia. I'm aware of Mount Arapiles down near Halls Gap, also under threat. Now, before we head to the break, though, a bit of good news on the environment front and another sign, I think, that the Coalition's doing what it needs to stand up to Labor. The Shadow Environment Minister, John O'Donnell, you often see him here on the program, has today announced that the Coalition, if elected, will scrap the $8 million in taxpayer handouts to the Environmental Defenders Office that currently receives that money from the Albanese government. You'll recall the Defenders Office was recently lambasted by a federal court judge for confecting evidence in a legal dispute with Santos. Dunham has said in his statement today the environmental lawfare the Environmental Defenders Office, the EDO, has engaged in needs to be called out. Industry partners need to have confidence that they won't drown in green and red tape when they invest in Australia. Labor has not held the EDO accountable for its inexcusable conduct in the Barossa court case. This is the Santos case and needs to do so. All right, we'll talk to Senator Dunham about that, I'm sure, tomorrow. All right, quick break. After the break, former Deputy PM John Anderson will join me for his take on the new left-wing ideologue in charge of our future fund, plus more attacks on our history, with one inner-city council considering that permanent removal of a Captain Cook monument. Welcome back. More dire warnings today, this one from our former Chief of Army, that our Defence Force simply isn't up to the challenges we're likely to face in the future. But first, I want to return to the decision yesterday to appoint former ACTU Chief, former Labor Climate Change Minister Greg Combet as head of Australia's $200 billion future fund. Already plenty of concerns are mounting that Combet's left-wing ideology will risk the fund. It'll make it invest in Labor's pet projects, particularly climate change investments, over investments that might yield, for taxpayers, better returns. David Murray, who chaired the board for 6 years, is already sounding the alarm. He says Combet has been a cheerleader for this so-called nation-building stuff. I think the risks here are substantial. Substantial, says Murray. He's a hard left player, Combet. For more on this and other things, I'm joined now by former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. Well, John, welcome. You, of course, were in office in the Howard government era when the Future Fund was created out of surpluses. I say this to my viewers, remember them. We actually invested money that we had in surplus to shore up pensions into the future and take that weight from taxpayers. But it was always meant to be a national sovereign fund, not a political war chest.
This is critically important. I believe that Peter Costello deserves a great deal of credit for identifying the way to set up an Australian sovereign wealth fund, an asset for all Australians. It was, in a way, an asset for asset swap, of course, because we invested wisely, the proceeds of asset sales. It's now grown massively and is very valuable as an asset for the Australian people and taxpayers. It's critically important, in my view, that it be conservatively but soundly managed to create more wealth for the Australian people. Governments of the day can pursue their programs, social and economic, because they're accountable to the people on regular election cycles. So Mr. Combet, and we will take, I think, as a granted that at this stage we have more reason to believe that his word might be his bond than the government that has appointed him should immediately make it clear that he understands the difference between building it as a wealth fund, carefully and conservatively managed, and using it inappropriately for government programs, social or economic, which should be undertaken by the government of the day with taxpayers' funds so that taxpayers can rule regularly on whether that was appropriate or not.
Look, another area I want to get your take on, and this is childcare, and it's, I think, of concern to taxpayers. It's not just when you've got kids in childcare. I think right across the board, we're seeing childcare loom to be an enormous money pit, both for parents. Some are paying $23,000 a year. Now, that's on par with some private schools. But also for taxpayers, we're spending some $13 billion a year subsidising childcare. Parents are still paying out of their pocket. We know most of these childcare centres are now for profit. They've got us over a barrel. There's a report out today from the ACCC saying we've got to tip more money into childcare. But how about we have a proper fair income discussion in this country? Rather than tip more money into childcare, how about we give parents some choices? How many parents out there, John, might say, geez, if I could have that $23,000 in my pocket, my wife or me, well, we mightn't go to work. One of us might stay home and raise our kids before they go to primary school. But you're almost forced, if you want government support, into the childcare system. And there's no support if you want to stay at home, one or either parent.
Well, what you say is music to my ears, because I 100% agree with what you've just said. There are several points that I would make. The first is that this is costing us a fortune that might be better deployed otherwise, because I don't think childcare is an economic management the way it's now pumped up to be. I don't think it's having the effect on labour market participation that the money we're spending on it would suggest that it is. That's point one. Point two is we need as a people to be absolutely honest. There's no greater asset, social or economic, than our children, and raising them up to be effective citizens and workers. I almost hesitate to say this because I know it's not popular, but we know that not only do many mothers, the statistics are very clear, despite what some people would have you believe, would prefer to do things differently, choice, as you put it. We also know, Steve Biddulph was brave enough to say this, that we really need to be concerned about the impact on very early children's development, about excessive amounts of childcare. There's no other way of putting it. I mean, facts are facts. We need to have an honest debate about this. Are we paying too much of a price? Are families paying too much of a price? And again, given that I don't believe this can be narrowly painted as an economic issue anymore, more money on childcare really amounts to social policy as much as economic policy. I stand to be corrected, but that is my clear understanding.
No, I agree with you.
We need an open and honest debate, and choice for parents, particularly in those early years, ought to be something we're really elevating.
And look at the drivers. We've got some evidence now, very clear, about huge suicide rates for our young people, very different than what they were generations ago. An explosion in mental health. Yes, we might have better diagnoses and people are more comfortable talking about mental health. But I think some of the things we do when kids are young, some of the things we impose financially burdens on families, I don't think we're thinking some of this stuff through. I think we have to have an honest debate. It's not a gendered debate. I agree with you, John. It's about giving families fair choices that they make that, you know, might suit them with child one, may not suit them with child two, but giving families autonomy, because after all, that $13 billion is the taxes from families that we're recycling mainly now to union-dominated childcare centres.
There are plenty of experts right across the Western world starting to say we really need to re-examine this. We need to be honest about what's in the best interest of our children. We don't have enough of them for a start. Australia will move into the rapid depopulation bomb category of nations in the next 10 to 15 years. I don't know how many of our viewers know that, but it's true. And of those we are having, the mental and social issues are enormous. We need to be asking ourselves, are we committed to our convenience or the best interest of our children? I think it's probably fair to say that you and I and many of our listeners We know that when we came into the world, people made massive and difficult adjustments for us. I wonder whether we have that same willingness to devote ourselves to our children and their well-being. I know these are prickly subjects, but for the sake of the children, can I say, we've got to have that debate and we need to be honest about it.
We do, John.
We need to recognise that we're
going to have a lot of tough conversations.
Particularly worried about it.
Right, I'll leave it there. We'll come back to that next week. John Anderson, thank you. How's that for a bit of a challenge discussion topic around the dinner table tonight? Let's go, though, to some other challenges we've got. Our Defence Force, we're told today by a former Chief of Army, General Lay, is dangerously unprepared for modern warfare. And experts like Defence writer Greg Credlin, well, he didn't miss when he slammed the Defence Force today.
Our Defence Force is so paralysed, so absolutely, unwilling to do anything which is not in its script from 10 years ago, that we have neither drones to attack people, our enemies, neither drones to defend airspaces, nor counter-drone capabilities on our ships or anywhere else. And it is a national scandal.
Well, Michael, I know we've got two systems on the way, on the long finger, let's call it, Boeing's Ghost Bat and the other one, the Ghost Shark. Are they going to arrive? And when they arrive, is it going to be too late? And these aren't even lethal, are they? I mean, give us a sense of how crook things really are.
Well, Peter, you're right. Neither Boeing's Ghost Bat, which is an uncrewed aircraft, or Anduril's Ghost Shark, an unmanned submarine, are going to be in service this year. Best case is 2025 for both of them. And they're very different to the kinds of drones we're seeing used in actual war. So both of them cost tens of millions of dollars each. You can't afford to have too many of them. The kinds of armed drones that experts are talking about are the ones we're seeing used in Ukraine, we're seeing used by the Houthis, the Iranians, the Israelis, and the Russians. They cost tens of thousands of dollars each. They're cheap. You can have lots of them. The Australian Defence Organisation seems to be the only defence organisation on the planet that hasn't got the memo about the need to have lots of cheap drones. That's the problem.
All right, well, talk to me about PNG today. I mean, I thought it was only a month or so ago we signed a security deal, $200 million, we were told, to keep them out of the clutches of China. Then comes a rumour that they're actually talking to China. They're talking to the Chinese government about using Chinese either money or servicemen and women on the ground for security support services in PNG, very close to us, of course. What's the truth of this?
Well, Peter, I think we need to take it very seriously. I was a bit disturbed when I saw Prime Minister Albanese say everything's fine because he had received a lovely text message on Australia Day from the PNG Prime Minister. I don't think that tells us anything. I think we've got to understand Beijing's going to keep pushing into countries like PNG and across the South Pacific, and they're willing to do things that Australia won't do, and they're willing to use their cash to get political influence and the presence of their security forces. So we need to not be complacent, and we need to work every day to make the partnerships with PNG work.
All right, well, allied to all of this is the concern today the Fijian military officer's been given command of Australia's troops. Accusations, of course, of human rights abuses. Michael, how serious is this?
Well, it's a real own goal. This should just be a really positive thing about the partnership between Fiji and Australia and our two militaries. But the Defence Organisation didn't do its homework. A simple internet search would have surfaced these serious allegations against the Fijian colonel. Nothing's been proven, but these allegations should have been dealt with while he was in Fiji, or maybe another nominee should have been appointed. It's turned a positive into a nasty controversy.
All right, I've got to take a break, Michael, but I tell you what, Richard Marles looks seriously asleep at the wheel. Michael Shibich, thank you for your time. After that break, we'll get on to that UNRWA funding. Now, we talked about that last night. This is the funding to what we think are terror groups. It's been put on pause. Well, wait till you find out how much we've paid UNRWA over the past decade and how much they've just rushed out the door before you noticed. And that Trump train certainly picking up momentum. Welcome back. Last night we brought you the good news that Labor has finally paused payments to the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, following those reports from some staff that were linked to the October 7 terror attacks. Well, there's been concerns about UNRWA for years. Concerns I've raised multiple times on this program, as many others have. I might say I also raised them when I worked in government. Now, this current pause leaves around $6 million of funding, money that was just announced by Penny Wong a couple of weeks ago, in limbo. But that pales into insignificance when you consider we've already given this dubious outfit nearly $200 million over the past decade. Between 2012 and 2020, the Australian government annually threw away $20 million to UNRWA until the coalition cut that amount to $10 million in 2020. But Labor's not only restored the full $20 million, we've now found out today that they paid it early this financial year. Joining me to discuss this, my international panel, Sky News contributor Kosha Garda, former Labor MP Michael Danby. Well, Michael, I don't know how long we've been talking about UNRWA. Real concerns about their links to terror. We also know the allegations of pensions being paid from aid money to the families of suicide bombers. I mean, this has got to stop.
This was a temporary agency set up 50 years ago and utterly corrupted and utterly infiltrated. All of the well-meaning people of the world, from Australia to Germany, are wasting their money on this outfit. It ought to be swapped out with UNHCR, whose hierarchy can't be infiltrated and who won't use the money they get from international donors to build a tunnel network bigger than the London Underground, or B, a third of their budget being paid for what they call pay for slay. So if you murder someone, you get a pension for your family. It's ridiculous.
And look, as I say again, I've been to Ramallah. I have seen that monument to the shaheeds there, and they glorify these suicide bombers.
If we want an end to this endless fanaticisation and terrorism, we've got to address the basic problem. And of course what will happen is that money will be restored because the Palestinians are in such dire stress inside Gaza. But medium term, Penny Wong and the ministers in this government swap it out with UNHCR. It's a simple and just solution.
And look how the people are being treated. We know the money doesn't even reach them. I think, Kosha, more broadly though, this is a UN body. You've got the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, with that mixed bag verdict, I have to say, part against Israel the other day. Why are we in the West, who believe in the rule of law, in a democratic nation, being dictated by the UN? When you look at the membership of the UN, they're either Islamist countries, they're dictatorships, they're all manner of Marxist communist types. They're ruling the roost. We're being lectured by them.
Absolutely. It's kind of like
put up with it.
Frankenstein monster sort of comes back and, you know, bites you. It had good origins. It made sense when it was set up, but it's a classic case of just something that's permanently temporary, as Michael said. It, you know, overstays its welcome. There's a lot of bloat, like everything else. There's these absurd paradoxes of the types of people that are on the Human Rights Council or anything else. As a longtime New Yorker, it just completely messed up traffic patterns and has prime real estate in New York and all of it. But it has support. It often becomes like a funnel for maybe people's pet causes that get funneled through, like what we just discussed. And just I think ships get harder to turn around when they get so big that it almost has to get to a point of complete distrust from the public for something drastic to happen, because otherwise there's no incentive to reform it around the margins.
I can't find a Republican watcher who says now that Trump won't win. We hear today that even after the next race, Nikki Haley reckons she's going to stay in. Do you think they're right?
It would seem that way. I think everybody's bracing for this black swan event that could happen, because what is unprecedented about this election is the lawfare and the whole thing with those felony indictments and everything else. And what will that do? We've never been in that. That's completely uncharted territory. So maybe she's hanging on for that reason or any other number of reasons. But if you just look at the organic support in the Republican Party and in the country in swing states right now, it would support what you're saying and what everybody's saying.
I read with interest Kevin Rudd over the weekend. It was like a yoga pose. I mean, he was such a contortionist now to try and find a way to get back in the Trump good books. But you know Rudd like I do. I mean, this is as much about Rudd saying, I'm relevant, don't sack me, I can get in with this administration if they win, Michael, than it is about trying to be even-handed in a political race.
Well, I'll have to be the diplomatic contortionist like Houdini to do that, given his past remarks. But the real problem is going to be not that he's not pliable enough, but that is Donald Trump vindictive? Will he remember these comments?
Sorry, is that a question?
Well, it is. I mean, will he be that vindictive that he remembers what Rudd said and then treat Australia badly? The pointy end of this is the cost of the subs. Will we get the nuclear class, Virginia class subs?
Yep.
At what cost? And or will the president say that we don't have enough for our own purposes? Australia can go and whistle Dixie.
All right, I'm going to put you on. 20 seconds to go. Put you on the spot. Will it be Biden-Trump?
I'm going to say 80% confidence, yes.
Biden-Trump?
No, Biden will fall before the election.
You and I are in the same camp. They'll pull a Swifty. I don't know who it is, but something will happen. They can't run with him.
Can't run with him.
All right, got to leave it there. Coach Garner, Michael Danby, thank you.
Doctor's report.
Doctor's report. There you go. Got to leave it there. That's it for me. See you tomorrow night. Here's Andrew Bolt.